I'll start by saying that one of the reasons I thought this would be a nice work for us to discuss is that I think John Mullan manages to communicate not merely his knowledge of Austen, but his delight. And it is contagious. More than any other critic or scholar or commentator, he just delights in Austen. And one thing that does is, for instance, it really, really helps me like Mansfield Park. I like Mansfield Park so much more after reading this book.
Excuse me, can everybody mute themselves except Holly, because people are on the mic and it jumps around on the screen.
You might also, my dog has something to say about this for some reason. Anyway, yeah, I like Mansfield Park a lot more after reading this book. It's not my favorite. If I could order the world the way I wanted, Austen would have finished Sanditon and left Mansfield Park as an unfinished manuscript, but oh well. So, you know, I think that another title of this book could be What is Delightful in Jane Austen? And having said that, now that you've all gone and muted your mics, I want y'all to tell me what delighted or intrigued you in this book, for those of you who read it.
I love the different subjects that he touched. You know, he talked about money, he talked about the people that weren't there but still spoke. He talked about all sorts of different things I would not have thought of. So that I was totally delighted reading it.
Yeah, the broadness and the eclectic nature of his insights is very satisfying.
Yes, I thought the subjects were amazing. I had never considered the significance of using a person's first name. I thought it was just a general formality thing that they would call Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett. But actually, you know, how Mrs. Elton is the key to understanding how people use the first name to be superior to them and to be showing their dependence on you. I thought that was really fascinating.
Well, and also the Mrs. Elton, the way she refers to Mr. Knightley as Knightley, and Emma's indignation on his behalf. It's one of those things. There's a degree of formality that was lost in English when we abandoned the second person singular, thee and thou, and just went with the second person formal you, you and you. That, you know, is there in other European languages. So yeah, they relied on names, honorifics to show respect and formality.
But also social status and class.
Yeah.
And continuing with the name things, one other thing I really got a kick out of that chapter was Mary and Charles Musgrove, and how they're one of the few Austen couples who actually refer to each other by their first names only, which really for them is almost a sign of disrespect to one another and when they're being contrary toward each other, whereas that's not really the case with other couples. And so that was kind of fascinating too.
Yeah. Other things?
Kirk has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so when I read the book, I got to the chapter of who doesn't speak. Perry, this, that. Wait, Georgiana Darcy? Wait, no, that can't be true. There's no way that's true. because she speaks in all the adaptations. So I run to my copy of Pride and Prejudice. No, no. Okay, she speaks here. No. Okay.
Yeah.
You win,
Yeah.
John Mullan.
Yeah, I had exactly the same reaction. Like, what? That can't be right, you know. But of course it is. Yeah. Similarly, I liked his observation that one reason Emma is so easy to adapt is because so much of it is conversation. You know, you just take the statements people say and you know, put it in a screenplay, and you've got a decent screenplay already. I also liked what he's something else he said about Emma, which is that a lot of the characters in Emma are monologists, whereas or monologists. I don't quite know how you would say that properly, but one thing about Emma and Mr. Knightley, and one reason you can tell they're destined to end up for each other, is that they are always in conversation with each other.
One of the chapters I thought the most delightful was about how things wouldn't have happened if there wasn't a blunder.
Mhm.
Of course, especially in Emma.
Yeah.
She's the queen of blunders,
She is. She is.
self-delusion, and
She is. And that's one of the things that makes Austen's novels timeless, I think, or ahead of their time, or at least still appealing to us, is that they're always complex psychological studies of how people deal with being wrong. I mean, that also was a very useful insight he presents, and really did. And as he points out, that's part of why we don't really like Fanny Price so much. She's never wrong.
I love Fanny Price. I think she's been maligned.
I like her
Yeah,
too. I
That's
don't have any problem with her not being wrong.
I much prefer Fanny to Emma, I must admit. And
yeah,
I
well, again, you know, Austen expected, that's the response Austen expected. That's why she said when she wrote Emma that she was going to write a book about a character no one but her would like. And Mullan also mentions Metropolitan, Whit Stillman's movie, in which Mansfield Park and whether or not Fanny is likable makes an appearance. So if you are a Fanny Price fan and you haven't seen Metropolitan, you should watch it. But they're nonetheless, Fanny Price is one of Austen's less popular heroines. What about the other novels? What about what he has to say about Pride and Prejudice, for instance?
You know, I really enjoyed this book. I didn't get too far into it, but I did skip ahead and read the last two chapters. Not because it was a novel and you just wanted to know how it ended, but you know, the conclusions. I'm not a romantic. I think you all know this. I find a lot of difficulties in, say, Emma ending up with Mr. Knightley. And of course, John Mullan does talk about the fact that he was in love with her when she was 13 years old. Okay, I do understand we're looking upon it from a modern context. So I just want to say, yes, it's not good to do that. There were different customs, traditions, and mores back there. But going back to what I said about skipping ahead to the last two chapters, I thought that the last one was really, really good. Is Jane Austen an experiential?
Experimental. How experimental is Jane Austen?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I have to
Yeah.
say, and jump up and down, yes,
Yeah.
she was. She was
Yeah.
such, she
Yeah.
veered away from the type of writing and the character development, the dialogue, the interior thoughts, not of all the characters, but definitely of the heroines, the interior thoughts. And the one chapter I read, I think I read up to 4 or 5 of the chapters. In one chapter, John Mullan talks about, did the author actually use I? And, we call it the fifth wall in film, where the characters speak right to the audience. And I never even noticed this at all. And there's only a few instances, but he did bring up a couple of instances where there is an I, and the author was speaking directly to the reader. And I thought that was amazing insight. And it did show, Jane Austen's attitude toward whatever she was talking about. Sorry, I can't quote it specifically, but I really, I've only read, I think, Evelina, when we did a Frances Burney book study. So I haven't read a lot of the contemporary novels of that time. However, I do know that because we see the interior thoughts of the characters, the 3 or 4 families in a country village and what they did from day to day, and yet the psychological development of the characters, especially in Emma, and how she became, how she grew from the very beginning to the very end, all of that to me was very new. And also the day-to-day goings on about the people in these villages, that became the plot, and Jane Austen devised, like, for example, in Emma, the red herrings about Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill, and, all of these things in seemingly a very simple lifestyle of these people. And I really appreciate that. And I think this is what we appreciate in novel reading, I think, in the modern day. We want to know about the characters. We want to know what their motivations are. We want to know if they grow, if they're psychologically growing. And that's why I think she was so experimental. And I know scholars have written about her style and how very experimental it was. I don't know enough to talk about it, but I see it in the consequences. We see it in the novels. And so that's why I love it. And I loved how you put it. What is, Holly, what is delightful in Jane Austen? And I love all of this.
Yeah.
What I like about his writing style is that so much of literary criticism is pedantic. It's really esoteric. It's only if you have a PhD in this area, Shakespeare, Henry James, or so forth, you understand it. But he's conversational. He welcomes you. He invites you in. And what did you all think about the chapter on proposals?
Yeah, it was like there's like no proposals practically, except for maybe Mr. Darcy's.
Yes, I'm violently, passionately in love with you. I always wonder at who people end up with, because I wanted Eleanor to have Colonel Brandon, who I think is the most romantic man in the 6 novels. And I really wanted Jane Fairfax to end up with Mr. Knightley, but I didn't write the novel, so I don't get to choose that. But I thought his what she does so brilliantly and kind of precedes Flaubert and Proust is the indirect discourse. And so you really have the sensibility of Emma and her thoughts. In fact, the whole novel, except there's one chapter with when Mr. Knightley, we get his perception of what's going on. And in this case, I think the reader is not clueless like Emma is. We're smarter than Emma is. We realize that she's making all the wrong choices for the people. But what I really liked about the book was the information about money, the information about what people say to one another and don't say to one another. I hadn't realized that Fanny Price is so quiet. She's also kind of she's really an outsider in that family, and she's so silent, so quiet. I thought that Mullan was very generous to Emma, but he loves that novel. He thinks it's really
Audible Inc. presents What Matters in.
Okay. And I thought Mullan was very generous to all, like I said, this is about delight. So he's very generous to Austen, to all the characters. He was very generous, for instance, to Miss Bates. And it is his generosity that allows him to notice things. For instance, he points out something I've never seen stated before, which is that Miss Bates actually is a reliable narrator. She actually sees what's going on and announces it, but everybody else is so used to discounting her that they don't, they miss crucial information.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think because of the way we are meant to, the way that Austen wrote Miss Bates' voice, we are meant to read right over it as well.
Yeah.
Because, when you've got this giant, monologue going on, you just kind of get through it.
Yeah.
But, like there's that great conversation that he brings up when Jane Fairfax and Mr. Why am I having Frank Churchill, thank you. I'm like, why am I calling him Mr.? Frank Churchill are up in the apartment by themselves pretty much with, elderly, blind, deaf Mrs. Bates. And it's dropped the hint in there, but we just bypass right through it and miss the important piece of information that Miss Bates is actually giving us.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Diana has a hand raised.
Yeah, I just was going to go back to the what Sylvia was saying about the difference between Jane Austen and her predecessors. I've read a few Fanny Burney and a few Anne Radcliffe novels, and what I would liken them to was when silent films, when everybody had to kind of like overact, and then Jane Austen is like when we finally get sound and people can just start acting naturally.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of a relief, because I found when I first read The Mysteries of Udolpho, I was like, man, there's just a lot of screaming. There's a lot of a lot of just screaming going on, and in all of those novels it's just kind of all and Jane Austen doesn't have to do that. She is far more natural. So that's all.
That is useful. I as far as, I read Evelina as an undergrad, but I much preferred Tom Jones by Fielding. And that's a picaresque novel where the plot proceeds from people having to go on ridiculous journeys. And the fact that, Emma never leaves Highbury is also an experimental thing. I mean, it really was a big deal to just write a novel about what happens in somebody's mind. I mean, Emma never leaves Highbury. So, that really was quite unusual as well. There's one thing that I want to say before I forget. So I did a little bit of poking around just in terms, like I looked at reviews to see what other people said about this book. And I found one review where the person was a little upset with John Mullan for saying that women could change their minds about proposals, but men could not. This person wanted Mullan to support his argument that women could change their minds. And the thing is, it wasn't an argument, it's just a statement of legal fact. Like he says, men could be sued for trying to withdraw a proposal they had issued. Women were not legally bound by accepting a proposal. And this is really important because women's legal status was so affected by marriage. Women ceased to exist legally when they got married. I probably, many of you have encountered this before. It's the law of coverture, which means that in matrimony, a man's identity covers his wife's, and she ceased to exist as her own legal entity and is instead an extension of her husband. This is why women couldn't sue for divorce, because they were actually part of the man, and a man can't divorce himself. So the only power women really had in the 19th century, in Austen's day, with regards to marriage, was to accept or reject a wedding proposal. And so it remained as absolute as their parents, as women's parents would let them. And we see this, for instance, when Mrs. Bennet tries to make Elizabeth marry Mr. Collins. And women before, very much before, about Regency, maybe a little earlier, second half of the 18th century, that's when women acquired this right to accept or reject suitors on their own. Before that, their parents could just make a decision for them. But that's one reason why it's such a big deal that Austen's heroines do say no, and they mean it. And that's their only real power. That's women exercising the only real power they had over how to shape their future happiness. And if a woman found out that she was engaged to, a rake, she better break the engagement, because her entire she had, once they were married, that was it. They had no options. So
I think what another important insight is, and what I really noticed in the films, is that the films are cast much older than, Eleanor is just 17, I believe. And as much as I love Emma Thompson, she's far older than the character would be. And Marianne is far younger. And I think that would give us a different perspective of the agency and the errors in judgment that the young women make in the novels. And so I thought that was insightful. A good essay to read is just type in The Guardian, because Mullan writes book reviews for The Guardian, and someone gives an assessment of his insights into this book.
Eleanor is 19 and Marianne is 17, I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
I did like his his stress on the age of Mr. Collins. And that was one thing I really appreciated in Longbourn. I checked the publication dates. This came out in 2012. Longbourn came out in 2013. And I couldn't help wondering a little bit if Jo Baker had read this. Perhaps not. She talked to us about how focused she is on her work, but I wondered if Mullan's book might have been a little different if Longbourn had come out first, if he might have discussed servants in Austen a little differently. Having mentioned Baker, I'll go ahead and invoke another chapter, his discussion of the weather. I don't remember which chapter that's in.
7, why is the weather important?
Duh, okay, yes.
It literally says it in the title, Holly.
Yeah. But it is. And Austen would have lived, several of the books were written before 1816, which was an important year that some of you may know. It was called the Year Without a Summer. There was a volcano that erupted in India, I think, in 2015 and just devastated weather patterns and crops and stuff. But that is that's the inn. The weather is the inn that gave Baker her entry to what she would write about Longbourn, the line about even the very shoe roses had to be got by proxy because of the rain. And I'm going to go ahead. Do people know what the pathetic Lucretia, are you raising your hand?
Yes,
It's Sherry. Oh, sorry.
It occurred to me rather strongly reading that chapter about the weather, that if Jane Austen had lived in Phoenix, there would have been a great deal less to talk about.
And then Sherry also has had her hand raised for a little while
Yes,
too.
But if you want to finish the weather, then I can go on to the
Go ahead.
next chapter.
Go ahead. It doesn't matter. Yeah, go ahead.
Sadly, I've not read a lot, but so this week school started and I teach English language development. I was trying to, nobody can stay awake very long. So you're trying to keep kids going because they're used to staying up till 4 a.m. Anyway, so I did 20 questions. And I said, let's play 20 questions. And everybody looked at me and said, well, what is that? And it made me start thinking about the games here because, you know, we used to play 20 questions all the time. We didn't have phones to sit there while we were driving somewhere to entertain ourselves like we do now. And, you know, you use 20 questions to engage. And I'm using it because I want to have them develop their very poor questioning. Because I'm thinking of an object, they're like a water bottle. You have to ask me broader questions, but whatever. But to the side of that, it made me look at what games do characters play. And I just thought that was so interesting because I hadn't really analyzed it the way he did of how the placement, and because what did he say, that the people at the time, they knew the games, and so they could picture the placement of how people would be participating, not participating, what the rooms might look like. I just thought that was so interesting, and how he used it to allow you to see what was happening in a smaller space of a table or somebody walking around from table to table. I think when you're reading it, you see it, but I hadn't looked at it sort of from the drone view, what that looked like in the different, and I didn't even finish this one chapter, but
Yeah, that was especially in the scene where Marianne's playing, there's a card game and Lucy and Eleanor are speaking under the cover of the music.
Right, to Lucy, Lucy Steele. Yeah, yeah. And the issue of gambling, how much, you know, the difference between probably we would think like playing penny ante poker versus somebody who's like really sitting, you know, men in a dark room with cigars and whiskey, like actually playing for serious stakes. Yeah, I hadn't really, I mean, there's this moment where Mrs. Bennet finds out that Wickham has gambling debts and she's like, a gamester. And so I kind of expected that to be the attitude about gambling throughout all of Austen, but no, Mullan explains that sometimes people did, you know, gamble for really small stakes. And
Yeah,
Okay.
Tom
Even-
Burke
even-
was one of the other ones that gambled for a lot.
yeah,
and so even at Netherfield, when Elizabeth was over there and they sort of, Caroline picks a game that she can't participate in. They were
That's
pointing out
exactly-
a little bit
yeah.
more of. yes,
it was
the
exactly
property.
that really made me understand this. Yeah.
Did you guys feel like there was a whole lot less Pride and Prejudice discussed than the other books? It seemed there were a lot fewer examples from Pride and Prejudice than the other books.
I kind of felt like, I thought like he touched on all of them, actually.
Yeah, he did. It's just that there seemed like there were fewer situations where Pride and Prejudice was used as an example, so.
I guess we could always check the index. I don't know. I didn't
I don't have it. I would listen to it on audiobook. I didn't buy it. So that's, I was trying to look up and see what the chapter headings were. That's why I made the noise. I had it on mute, but then it didn't go to mute. So
there, I mean, just looking at it, just looking at the index, there are more entries on Pride and Prejudice than on Persuasion and way more on Pride and Prejudice than on Sense and Sensibility. I mean, just that's a very
I'll have to listen.
unscientific glance at the index. I don't know.
I'll have to
Um,
listen again, I guess.
It seemed like there was a lot of Emma.
There's a lot of Emma, and it seems like there's a lot of Mansfield Park.
I did think there was a lot on Mansfield Park. And again, it's what Janine mentioned about his generosity. He's so generous to all the novels and all the characters. It's really pleasant, actually. Diana.
Back to Mansfield Park. And you were, when you were talking about women's power, and they only had the power to say no. I feel like Fanny, everybody loves to hate on Fanny, but as being a wuss and being so, such a milquetoast or whatever. But she really stood her ground to say no to Henry Crawford. And when her uncle was making threats and he was doing everything he could to force her to accept Henry Crawford, and she absolutely said no. And then she got punished for it, sent back to her family home, but she still wouldn't waver. And so, I kind of have a big thumbs up for Fanny.
Yeah. Well, this is why we read A Room of One's Own, whenever that was, a year or so ago. And there's a place where Woolf talks about what a daughter who disobeys her parents in the matter of marriage could be subjected to. She could be locked up, she could be thrown around the room, she could be beaten, so it was a very big deal. Yeah, absolutely. And they did not beat the crap out of Fanny, but they did just about everything else they could think of. It really, and the fact that women had this one power, the power to say no, didn't mean that they weren't subjected to all sorts of coercion and cruelty in an effort to take that power away from them.
I'm one of the few people that have grown up in a culture where love is not the biggest thing in a relationship. My parents were married at 15 and 17. They lived in neighboring villages in rural China, and they met each other on their wedding day. And I think you have to remember that socialization that affects both the man and the woman. It's not like you're just socialized into accepting because it's the best thing for you and your family. And that's how kind of I was brought up. You do the best thing there is for a family, your family. And, I've always thought that love so that's why I think Jane Austen was also very experimental. She really talked about love between a man and a woman in a relationship. And that was really out of the ordinary back in the day, because I personally don't think that love really entered into it until the Victorian era. And if you look, I've been around English society more than I probably want to, but they're so rigid in so many ways. And one of them, especially when we watch things like Gosford Park, when it was just accepted that, an English country, a house party was just sleeping around. Like people made assignations at night. No one talked about it. And as long as the woman did flaunt it in front of the husband and vice versa, it was all accepted. We in the West just really can't understand that, because the minute someone has an affair, that's an automatic, I'm divorcing. So I've kind of grown up with a different view. I love Jane Austen because she talked about women's agency. I love the fact that you brought up, Holly, that yes, she could say no. And that to me is a big thing. It's a huge advantage. So I think that was really good. And there was certainly a lot of coercion, a lot of unhappiness, but looking at society's mores then and now even, it's just the way it was. And, you know, I personally, one of my favorite characters in the whole of Pride and Prejudice is Charlotte Lucas, because she knew what she had to do and went after it. And I wish she could have chosen someone else, but, you know, I really would envision an okay life for her. Maybe she wasn't super ecstatically happy and passionately in love, but she sure figured out, you know, how to make her life comfortable for herself, and being mistress of a household was a big thing. So
yeah,
I think these people just ended up where they were supposed to, really.
I think that's a good point too, Sylvia, because I mean, I think because of that reason, she's so adaptable to different adaptations with different cultures. Like nowadays, like I'm thinking of Sonia Kamal's Unmarriageable, which takes place in kind of modern Pakistani, but because the culture is so similar to what it kind of was in Regency era, you know, it just transfers over into a modern adaptation with no problems whatsoever.
yeah. One thing on the Gosford Park and the house parties and stuff, I read somewhere that the tea dress was a fashion innovation that came from that time and place, because they were super easy to get in and out of. So you could take them off and have sex in the afternoon.
Oh.
But another thing, so I grew up Mormon, and Mormons care about marriage even more than Jane Austen. And I did quite a bit of scholarly work on Mormons and marriage. And a book I read that helped me understand Austen and helped me understand a whole bunch of things is Marriage, a History by a woman named Stephanie Kuntz, last name Coontz. And precisely what Sylvia was talking about, the idea that marriage was far too important for the survival of a community to be decided by something as fickle and silly and transient as two people's sexual attraction to one another. You had to make very careful, pragmatic considerations of not just the family, you know, an immediate family, but an entire community when it came to something like who you were going to partner with and reproduce with. And it really is an innovation of Northern European culture. That it was just way more considered that you would, have affairs. People, the things like Tristan and Isolde, or Heloise and Abelard, where, or Lancelot and Guinevere, where the romantic lovers were separated by marriage. That was the continent. That was, most love affairs were tragedies because you weren't married to the person you were in love with. You were married to somebody practical. And the happy ending in a love story is a British invention. And it was perfected by Austen. Yes, whoever is with Sherry.
Hello.
Hi, Patty.
Hello, it's me. The one thing that struck me, she says, basically, you know, I know he's a dork and I married him, but we're not together that much. He goes outside and does stuff. He's not in my hair. And so my life is relatively peaceful except for when he comes in. So like their style of daily life is just so different. I mean, you're like, husbands are underfoot all the time these days. They come home every day. They stick around all evening. They don't go off to the club. So like, it would be easier to be with somebody who was not all that palatable because you're not around that much.
But Charlotte, she's mistress of her own household, and she's going to, when Mr. Bennett dies, Mr. Collins is going to inherit the Bennett home. And so
Yeah.
she's going to be financially secure. And a marriage is a social, it affects everyone in your family. Look how profoundly the unwise marriages affect the Bennetts and the solutions to that. But being socially part of this community, and their small communities, being financially secure, where marriage is the woman's career in Austen, and it's a lifelong commitment. And adultery was not accepted. You look what happens in Mansfield Park and how banished the older Bertrand daughter is.
Adultery was accepted if you did it right.
Excuse me, I'm not done. There's one thing I wanted to say.
You're
too.
wrong.
Something that I like, well, that's rather a strong statement. The one thing I do like about Emma is how caring she is of her father, and how Mr. Knightley is really very, very caring, and is willing to live and accommodate her. And so I think that shows great on Emma's part. It elevates her in my estimation.
So there was plenty of room for adultery, as Mary Crawford points out when she talks about how Maria Bertram and her brother Henry Crawford could have handled their attraction, that it could have been this standing meeting every so often. And the house party, there was the BBC did a bunch of series on daily life in England, and one of them was called the Regency House Party, and it talked about how the standard way for people to pursue adultery was for women who had gone through menopause to sleep with younger men because they couldn't get knocked up, and there wasn't a worry about paternity. Older women were quite prized in the Regency era, and that's why the joke at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, where Mr. Bennet says he's going to go send the daughters to audition for marriage with Mr. Bingley, and he says, you know, why don't you go too, Mrs. Bennet? He might like you best of the bunch. That was a real possibility. It was not uncommon for 25-year-old men to sleep with 40-year-old women. So, you know, you know, every culture has always found ways to tolerate some sort of illicit sexual behavior.
Not in the Middle East. The women are beheaded. The women are tortured.
You know,
strangled.
Again, you got to do it right. I mean, yes, there are significant penalties for doing it wrong, but every society has had, I mean, yes, there were, you could be burned, you could be cast out, but if you had enough wealth, and if you were discreet enough, and if you followed the right rules, people found ways to do what they wanted. And sometimes they paid really heavy prices for it, like Maria Bertram, but sometimes they got away with it.
You know, I was thinking about Emma, and I've wanted to have a different ending for her. I know that Jane Austen wrote novels of love and marriage, certainly when she was in her 20s, when she wrote most of those books. I was thinking that if she had lived longer, she would have definitely veered away from that. And the reason I say this about Emma was she was the one heroine that did have money. She really didn't have to marry. And she even said that, you know, when she was talking to Harriet. So Emma did display some really great, in my opinion, talents and skills. She could have been a patroness of Mrs. Goddard's school, been on the early parts of the movement to educate women, girls and women. She could have, continued on in later life to be part of the abolitionist movement in England. And there was a lot of things. And if she had applied herself to painting, writing, all those things that Mr. Knightley knocked her about, she might have been a painter or a writer, just like Jane Austen or Frances Burney. So I think because women didn't have agency in those days for a lot of stuff, but the women who had money at least had some way of breaking through. And I don't know if marriage was that important. I guess it was, especially for families that were not as well off. But I think Emma could have contributed so much more to Highbury if she hadn't taken that path. And because my problem with Emma is the problematic age and relationship difference between her and Knightley. Sorry, I didn't say Mr. Knightley, didn't mean to be that familiar in referencing Mr. Knightley. Anyway, the fact that he was more of a father figure and the fact that Emma didn't want to leave her father, I just thought that was problematic. I think she married her father basically, because that's all society would. I know that's tough to say, but I think that's what society would have only allowed, was that she marry someone, in her age range, but she was looking for a father figure. That's all. I know that's controversial, and I understand. I also, this is totally off that subject, but as a statistician, one of the problems that people do when you're looking back in time, and, I used to do retrospective studies in the medical field, is that you try to look for cause and effect looking back. And it's hard to do. A lot of people have hypotheses and then they look back or look at, the literature and say, oh, this fits my hypothesis. So especially when I read literary criticism, because Austen didn't produce that much, we tend to kind of look back and pick and choose those things that kind of support our thoughts. And I'm not saying Professor Mullan did that, but I think, when I read this, I just had to have a grain of salt to it, because you have to know about the customs at the time, the name. One of the things I thought about the naming and how people refer to their spouse, and, a lot of that could have been taken with a grain of salt, because, the first daughters were named after the mom, the first sons were named after the dad. And, you got a lot of these names, a lot of the same names in a family. The fact that husbands referred to, I remember Mrs. Elton always referred to Mr. Knightley as Knightley, and that was taking some intimacy, because she wasn't qualified to do that. I didn't really think of it that way. I just thought, that was her arrogance or whatever, she was taking some liberties. But that's kind of, I love Professor Mullan. I've had a chance to see him way back in 2003 when we all went to England, and he gave us a lecture on when the Jane Austen Society went over there. And he's amazing. He's quite a scholar. But I think we have to think about that too when we look at some of these, these books, these treatises.
What was your favorite chapter in Mullan's book?
Well, I didn't read, I think it was up to, why is it risky to go to the seaside? I really took that one with a grain of salt.
Sherry, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I didn't mean to backtrack or go down a bunny
Go
track.
right ahead.
But I'm so intrigued by the idea of a woman being able to refuse a proposal was her only power. And yes, obviously we have lots of examples of it happening in real life and in literature, but I'm so intrigued by that. How did that come about? How did they gain that power? Was it an act of parliament? I mean, or was it just custom? Or if it was legal, it had to have been through courts or I'm intrigued by that, and that might just be a tangent that we don't want to go off on right now, but I'm
I
curious.
recommend Stephanie Kuntz.
Stephanie Kuntz,
She's
okay.
It's a very insightful book. And it was an innovation. I forget the details, but yeah, there was a for most of European history, parents
Yeah,
chose their children's spouses, and they did so as a matter of pragmatism, even in terms of the upper classes and the nobility. How would an alliance benefit, the larger political community? So
I think religion plays a role here. The Protestant religion, the Book of Common Prayer, and the idea, just as women could read the Bible, individuals can read the Bible and interpret it, that you can't coerce someone into a marriage. And so I think that religion played a role in the autonomy of a woman in saying yes or no to a man's proposal, although there would be tremendous familial pressure to do what the parents advised them to do.
well, you weren't supposed to do that in Catholicism either, and Catholicism respected nuns and celibacy in ways Protestants don't. It was always safe to run off if you really wanted to avoid marriage. Catholics could just go to a nunnery. So that was an option that Protestant women didn't have quite so readily. And England, I mean, marriage wasn't even religion did play a huge role in religion, because for a very long time, marriage was strictly a secular thing. There was no religious ceremony for marriage. That had to be invented at the point when the Catholic Church decided it wanted more control over people's sex lives. So anyway, we're about done. Do we? Well, I should say it's 3 o'clock.
Yeah, any
Anybody
final
for-
questions or final thoughts that somebody wants to say before we give announcements for next month?
Yeah,
one quick note, Janine, I put in the chat the link for the tea company.
Thank you, Sherry.
You're welcome.
Lovely. Thank you, Sherry.
All right, Lucretia, take it away.
I kind of wondered, reading this book, he picks all these different little aspects to look at, to consider. And I wondered how much of that is intentional on Jane Austen's part, and how much just came out of her point of view and was natural to her.
Well, Lucretia, I was thinking of the same. Well, my point was, you could read someone else and someone has a different take on it. It's just, I hate, it's so hard to know, because Jane Austen herself, as we know, didn't write about how she thought when she wrote. A lot of the letters were destroyed. If you do read the letters, what I've always thought was very interesting is Jane Austen was so much more forceful in the letters. She really had her opinion about things and stated it and wrote it down.
I have not read her letters, and I was attracted to the idea that one should, and I will look for them.
She makes stinging comments about neighbors, about
Yes.
What?
I think
audiences.
what was wonderful about Mullan, I'm gonna reread all her novels this year, and I'm gonna look at them with fresh eyes. And I think that he was a delightful author, and I'm going to discover new things when I reread Austen. And thank you for choosing this marvelous book, Emily.
Yeah.
I chose
Well,
it.
Actually, Holly chose it, so we got to give it to Holly. And thanks for Holly for choosing it, because on top of that, our next event next month, John Mullan will actually be joining us to discuss said book. So that's our next presentation. It's on Saturday, September 9th at 10 a.m.